That evening, the house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, Liam's favorite. I'd taken extra care with dinner, hoping for one of those quiet nights where conversation drifts easily between us. But his eyes weren't on me. They were glued to his phone, lighting up every few minutes with that familiar little buzz. Each time it vibrated, he smiled. Not politely, not absently, but with genuine amusement. When I finally asked who was keeping him so entertained, he barely looked up. "Oh, it's just Olivia," he said with a chuckle. "You know, the new project manager I told you about. She's hilarious." I remember smiling too, or at least pretending to. "Ah, Olivia," I said, my voice light. The name already felt too comfortable in our kitchen, too often repeated. He didn't notice. He just kept talking, describing her wit, her energy, the way she gets things done. It was as if she'd become the pulse of every story he had to tell. Then came the words that made the air in the room shift. "She reminds me of you," he said, grinning. "Just younger and a little more spontaneous." I laughed softly, but inside, something cold uncurled. Younger, more spontaneous. That's how comparisons begin. Disguised as compliments, designed to sting later. I finished my wine in silence, already feeling the distance growing between us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sheets felt colder on my side, the clock louder than usual. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his quiet chuckles coming from the office down the hall. The sound used to comfort me, proof that he was home, safe, close. But now, every laugh felt like a thread snapping somewhere inside me. I didn't need to ask who he was texting. I already knew. I thought about how easily admiration can disguise itself, how it starts as professional respect, then grows roots in every casual joke, every shared glance. I remembered when Liam used to tell stories about me that way, his eyes lighting up with pride. Now, it was her name, Olivia, that filled the air between us. A stranger I'd never met, yet already competing with me in my own home. When he finally came to bed, I pretended to be asleep. He slipped under the covers, the scent of his new cologne clinging to him, sharper, unfamiliar. It used to be cedarwood, now it was something cooler, younger. I kept my breathing steady, pretending not to notice, but my heart was racing beneath the blanket. It's strange how betrayal doesn't announce itself. It whispers. And that night, it whispered her name through every corner of our room. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, warm and golden, but it felt almost mocking. Liam sat at the table, laughing at something on his phone again, one hand wrapped around his coffee mug. I watched him from the kitchen counter, my fingers tracing slow circles over the rim of my glass. "You're in a good mood," I said, keeping my tone light. He grinned. "Just something Olivia sent. She's got this wicked sense of humor." Her name rolled off his tongue like a habit, like it belonged there. I nodded, pretending not to notice how easily she'd become part of his daily rhythm. The way he smiled when he said her name, the spark in his eyes, I hadn't seen that look directed at me in months. I told myself not to read into it, that marriages go through phases. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a phase. It was a shift, slow, silent, dangerous. When he left for work, I stayed at the table long after the door closed, staring at his half-empty coffee cup. It still carried the imprint of his lips, a faint, careless trace of routine. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't arrive as thunder. It drips, like water through a crack in the ceiling, until one day the whole thing collapses. And though I didn't know it yet, that first drop had already fallen. It started small, a mention here, a casual story there. But soon, Olivia's name was everywhere. At breakfast, during car rides, even on quiet Sunday mornings when Liam used to read the paper in silence. Now, he'd scroll through his phone, saying things like, "Olivia nailed that presentation yesterday. You should have seen her." I'd smile, sip my coffee and say, "You seem impressed." He'd shrug and grin. "She just gets things done. It's refreshing." Refreshing. That word clung to me for hours, like perfume I never wore. I started noticing little shifts, barely visible to anyone else, but unmistakable to me. A new cologne on his skin. longer showers, late nights at the office. He even joined a gym, something he'd sworn he'd never have time for. Each new habit felt like another piece of him slipping away, one subtle change at a time. I watched it happen quietly, taking mental notes, collecting moments like evidence I didn't yet want to believe. Then came the first undeniable sign. One night, while folding laundry, I found a lipstick-stained napkin tucked inside his jacket pocket. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Great night. Oh. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The lipstick was a shade I'd never wear. Too bold, too young. I stared at it for a long time before placing it in my drawer, next to the bank statements I'd started saving. If this was a game, I decided, I'd stop playing defense. After that night, everything he did felt like a clue. The way he checked his phone with a half smile when he thought I wasn't looking. The sudden bursts of energy when he mentioned work. Even the music in his car changed. Upbeat, younger, careless. I used to hum along to his playlists. Now I just listen for names. And sure enough, there she was again, tucked into every story he told. Olivia said this. Olivia did that. It was as if he'd found a new language, one I wasn't fluent in anymore. I began paying closer attention, not out of jealousy, but out of clarity. I needed to see the truth without the haze of excuses. I checked his credit card statements, noted the restaurants, the dates that didn't line up with his supposed late nights. My heart raced every time I found something off, but strangely, I also felt steady, grounded in the coldness of fact. There's power in knowing, even when it hurts. Some nights, I'd sit alone in the kitchen, the clock ticking softly, that napkin in the drawer like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I'd picture them, her laughter, his eager attention, and then I'd look around the house we'd built together. Every wall, every photo, now looked like evidence in a case I hadn't yet filed. But I knew I would. I was done waiting for the truth to introduce itself politely. By the third week, his lies had rhythm. They arrived on schedule, every late meeting, every team dinner. I stopped questioning him aloud. Instead, I listened, memorized, and documented. My phone became a vault of screenshots, receipts, timestamps. I wasn't driven by rage anymore. It was something colder, sharper. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm. During breakfast one morning, he mentioned her again, mid-laugh, as if saying her name was harmless. Olivia's really helping me get back in shape, he said, buttering his toast. We're training partners now. I met his eyes just long enough for him to flinch. How nice, I said softly. It's good to have motivation. He didn't catch the weight behind my words. Maybe he didn't want to. That night, I stood by the window, watching his car lights fade into the distance. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar. Not broken, but focused. I realized something then. Betrayal doesn't end when it's discovered. It ends when the betrayed decides what to do with it. And I had already decided. The next time I heard her name, I wouldn't just listen. I'd act. I woke up that Friday with a plan. Liam had forgotten his lunch the day before, so I decided to surprise him. Or at least that's what I told myself. I packed his favorite meal, a small act of love that now felt more like strategy, and drove to his office without calling ahead. The receptionist, a kind woman with nervous eyes, greeted me warmly, until I mentioned Liam's name. Her smile faltered just slightly, like a curtain slipping out of place. Hi, I said cheerfully, holding up the bag. I just came to surprise my husband with lunch. She hesitated. Oh, he's actually out to lunch already. My stomach tightened. Oh? With who? I asked, still smiling. Her voice dropped. He and Olivia went out about 20 minutes ago. There it was, the name again, spoken softly, but it hit like thunder. I thanked her politely, pretending the words hadn't cracked something inside me. I walked back to my car, the lunch bag heavy in my hands. I waited in the parking lot for nearly an hour, my heartbeat matching the ticking clock on the dashboard. When they finally appeared, laughing, his hand brushed her arm. Casual, familiar, intimate. My chest burned, not with jealousy, but with clarity. Betrayal looks ordinary from the outside. It's the quiet way two people lean too close, believing no one's watching. I drove home in silence, the untouched lunch beside me, the smell of roasted vegetables filling the car like a memory that didn't belong anymore. Every red light gave me time to think, to breathe, to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be in that moment, the one who screams or the one who plans. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the choice was made. I reheated the same meal that evening, plated it beautifully, and waited for him to come home as if nothing had changed. When he finally walked through the door, his face was flushed from the evening air, or maybe from guilt. "Rough day?" I asked lightly. "You look tired." He smiled faintly, loosening his tie. "Yeah, long one. Back-to-back meetings." I almost laughed at how easily the lie came. Instead, I poured him a glass of wine and said, "I made your favorite." The domestic normalcy of it all made the betrayal feel surreal, like watching someone act out your life while you stand just off stage, invisible. We ate in silence. The only sound was the soft clink of cutlery against the plates. Every detail burned into me, his casual tone, the way he chewed, even the ring of his phone lighting up beside him. I didn't need to check who it was. I already knew. But that night, I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. I wanted to choose the right words, the right moment, the one that would make him remember this conversation for the rest of his life. Later that night, I walked into his office doorway, my voice steady though my pulse raced. "How's Olivia?" I asked. He looked up, startled, as if I'd used a forbidden word. "What do you mean?" he said too quickly. I tilted my head, smiling faintly. "I mean, how is she when she's not flirting with married men over lunch?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. His face went pale. "It's not like that. You're overreacting. She's just a friend." I stepped closer, still calm, still smiling. "Friends leave lipstick on napkins now?" I asked, almost kindly. His jaw tightened, panic flickering behind his eyes. "Sophia, it's innocent. I swear." "Innocent?" I interrupted. "That's one word for it. Let's see if your boss agrees." He froze then, truly froze, the color draining from his face as if he finally saw the version of me he'd created. He tried to speak again, but I was already walking away, leaving him in the glow of his computer screen and his unraveling excuses. In that moment, I realized I didn't need to scream or cry. I had something far more powerful: composure. And the next time we'd talk about Olivia, it wouldn't be in this house. It would be somewhere he'd never expect. In the days that followed, I moved carefully, the way you do when handling something fragile, like glass about to break. Liam acted distant but cautious, clearly unsure how much I knew. That worked in my favor. Every smile, every question I asked, was part of my preparation. I wasn't interested in confrontation anymore. I was building a case. The napkin, the messages, the receipts, they became pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to complete. I scheduled a private lunch with Mr. Collins, Liam's boss, a family friend who had watched us grow from newlyweds into whatever we were now. "I wouldn't usually get involved in work matters," I began, my tone polite, "but I think you should know. Liam's been mixing personal pleasure with professional projects." His eyebrows rose, a flicker of disappointment more than shock. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. I slid the folder across the table, my hand steady. "Receipts, texts, photos, everything you need." He didn't say much after that, just a slow nod, a quiet thank you, and a promise to handle it discreetly. I walked out of that restaurant lighter than I'd felt in months. It wasn't revenge yet, not fully. It was justice slowly taking shape, and I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A week later, the news found its way home. Liam came through the door like a man on fire, his face red, his tie askew. I didn't flinch. I was arranging flowers on the dining table, a picture of calm. "You went to my boss?" he shouted, voice cracking. "You ruined my job." I looked up slowly, meeting his rage with silence first, because silence unnerves the guilty more than words ever could. Then softly I said, "No, Liam. You ruined your marriage. I just made sure everyone saw what I've been living with. He stared at me, stunned, as if hearing himself for the first time. You had no right, he spat. You embarrassed me. I tilted my head. Embarrassed you? I only told the truth. What you did, that's the part that's shameful. I walked past him, handed him an envelope, and waited. He tore it open with shaking hands, his breath catching as he saw the divorce papers inside. You can keep your admiration for Olivia, I said, voice even. But not my name, not my house, and definitely not my dignity. For the first time in months, I felt my pulse slow, steady, a rhythm I recognized as my own. He said something else after that, but I wasn't listening. I was already walking toward the future, one deliberate step at a time. The next morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. No clinking coffee cups, no soft hum of his voice on early calls. Just sunlight spilling across the table where his wedding ring now lay. A small metallic confession. I picked it up, turned it in my hand, and realized how light it was. Funny how something once heavy with promise could feel like nothing at all. I placed it in a drawer and shut it, gently but decisively. Word spread fast at his company. The HR investigation began almost immediately, and by the end of the week, both Liam and Olivia were suspended pending review. I didn't need updates. I already knew how this story would end. She'd vanished to save her career, and he'd crumble under the weight of his own choices. Watching from a distance, I felt no guilt. Only clarity. Some lessons need to be learned in the dark. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the same woman who'd once begged for attention at her own dinner table. She was sharper now, quieter maybe, but dangerous in her peace. And though the world outside looked unchanged, mine had finally shifted back into my hands. It didn't take long for everything to fall apart. The company fired him for misconduct, and Olivia, his refreshing new muse, disappeared almost overnight. People like her always do when the spotlight burns too bright. I heard about it through a mutual friend, though I didn't ask. Word travels fast when disgrace is involved. Still, I felt nothing. Not anger, not joy. Just a quiet satisfaction, like closing a book you've already memorized. Days turned into weeks, and then one evening, a knock echoed through the house. When I opened the door, he was standing there, drenched, disheveled, holding the weight of his own undoing. Sophia, he said, voice shaking. Please, I made a mistake. I love you. His eyes searched mine for something that no longer existed. Once I might have reached for him out of habit, but that woman, the one who waited, forgave, hoped, she was gone. You loved the attention, I told him softly. That's not the same thing. He looked stunned, like I'd spoken a language he'd never learned. Can't we start over? He pleaded. I almost smiled. Start over? I said, leaning against the doorframe. Liam, you're the reason I finally started living. And with that, I closed the door, not in anger, but in peace. The sound of the rain swallowed his silence as he faded into the night. The days that followed were oddly still, almost tender in their quietness. I woke up early again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The sun painted slow gold lines across the kitchen floor as I brewed my coffee, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. Liam called a few times after that night, but I didn't answer. His voice lived in my voicemail now, echoing the same regret on repeat. I didn't need to hear it. Regret is just guilt looking for an audience, and I was done playing mine. Friends asked how I was doing, their eyes soft with pity. I'm fine, I'd say, and for once it was true. I wasn't healed yet. Healing isn't something that happens in a single breath, but I was steady. I'd stopped replaying his excuses in my head, stopped wondering if I'd done something wrong. I knew better now. Love doesn't fail because of time or boredom. It fails when admiration turns outward, and the person you trusted forgets to look back. Sometimes I'd pass by the mirror in the hallway and barely recognize the woman staring back. She looked lighter, freer, almost untouched by what had happened. But I knew better. Scars don't always show. Some just make you stand taller. Every time I looked into my own eyes, I saw proof that pain, when used wisely, becomes armor. Weeks passed before the final piece of news reached me. Liam had moved out of town. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Just gone. I imagined him somewhere small and quiet, nursing the remains of his pride, maybe wondering how everything he built collapsed so quietly. But the truth is, it didn't collapse. I just stopped holding it up. There's a certain beauty in letting something fall when it no longer deserves to stand. Sometimes at night, I'd think about how easily admiration had replaced affection, how quickly he'd handed his loyalty to someone who offered novelty instead of depth. It used to make me ache, but not anymore. Now it only reminded me how much of myself I'd given away, and how much I'd reclaimed. Freedom doesn't roar, it hums, steady and soft, right beneath your ribs. I could feel it every time I exhaled. One evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, listening to the rain, the same sound that once hid his pleading voice outside my door. This time, it didn't sound sad. It sounded like cleansing, the kind that washes away what no longer belongs. I leaned back, eyes closed, and let the rain drown out the last echoes of his name. What came after wasn't revenge anymore. It was rebirth. Months later, life had softened into something unrecognizable, in the best way. My mornings began with the scent of paint instead of burnt coffee. I'd turned the small guest room into a studio, sunlight spilling across half-finished canvases and jars of brushes that reminded me of who I was before I became someone's wife. The first time I picked up a brush again, my hand trembled. But the color, oh, the color. It felt like breathing for the first time after holding it too long. Work came easily, too. I'd started consulting for small businesses, helping them find the right words to tell their stories. It was ironic, really, spending years unheard, only to make a living teaching others how to speak. There was something healing in that symmetry. Each project felt like a quiet victory, a step toward the version of myself I'd once buried under compromise and polite smiles. One afternoon, Julia stopped by, as she often did, her laughter echoing through the studio like sunlight through glass. "You seem so at peace, Soph," she said, tilting her head as she looked around at my paintings. I smiled, wiping a bit of ochre from my hand. Because I finally remembered what it's like to be the woman someone admires. And this time, that someone is me. In the evenings, I'd walk home through the quiet streets, the sky bruised with sunset. Sometimes I caught my reflection in shop windows, not searching, not comparing, just existing. The woman looking back at me wasn't waiting for validation anymore. She moved slower, but with purpose, like someone who finally knew her own rhythm. There's a kind of elegance in solitude when it's chosen, not imposed. It's the sound of your own heart finally having space to speak. One evening, as I locked up the studio, I passed a couple walking hand in hand. For a moment, the man's profile caught the light. Familiar jawline, familiar gait. My chest didn't tighten this time. I just smiled faintly, recognizing the echo of a story I'd already outgrown. They laughed together, and it sounded like freedom too, just a different kind. I kept walking. At home, I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the steam curl into the air. The same house that once felt like a cage now felt like mine again. Every wall repainted, every silence reclaimed. I'd stopped filling the emptiness with what-ifs. Instead, I filled it with music, with color, with myself. Healing wasn't loud. It was steady, patient, almost tender. It's strange how time reshapes pain. What once felt unbearable now sits quietly in the background, like an old photograph you no longer have the urge to frame. Every so often, I still think about the woman he couldn't stop talking about, Olivia, with her charm and laughter, but not with anger anymore. She was just a mirror reflecting what he lacked, not what I did. The truth is, he didn't choose her over me. He chose the version of himself that needed admiration to survive, and I let him. Once. Now, I wake up to something entirely different. My own admiration, my own peace. The woman I see in the mirror each morning isn't defined by what she lost, but by what she refused to forget. her worth. There's a quiet power in rebuilding without needing anyone to notice. That power hums in my veins like a melody only I can hear. As I lock the studio each night, I glance at my reflection in the glass door, not searching for closure, but honoring the story that brought me here. And in a voice only I can hear, I remind myself, he taught me how easily admiration can turn into obsession. But I taught him what happens when it meets intelligence.